So in this session, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've run an open pedagogy student-created book project, and stop me at any point with any questions.
Yeah.
So why consider having your students write a book? One is it's a form of active learning. And we know that when students are actively engaged in the learning process, they learn more and they learn it more deeply. Um, that when they have to put things together in a framework that makes sense and one that they're going to try to that they're willing to share with other people, it tends to force people to analyze things much more deeply and in a way that they're, again, more likely to recall things in the long run. It's very engaging that that students get excited when they know they're going to create something that's going to be publicly shared. It's the opposite of what David Wiley has called a disposable assignment, which is something where students will write a paper or do some work, submit it in the learning management system, and then it all disappears at the end of the semester and they never see it or use it again. Because in this case, they're creating something that has a life beyond the course itself. And yeah, that's the term, non-disposable assignment. And it's more fun, that it's somewhat different than the usual term paper or just a discussion posts and so forth. And having a little bit more variety and adding this additional creativity to it generally is something that students find rewarding. And I certainly find this more rewarding than reading the same types of papers I've been reading for decades now. And it's generally a collaborative project where students are working in groups and they learn quite a bit from that process in terms of group dynamics and group work as well. And another nice thing is when students are working in a group in a project that's highly scaffolded from the beginning to the end, they can't just go out and find something they can copy and paste in. And especially since they know the work is going to be publicly shared, they know that if they do copy and paste work from someone else, there's some chance at least that the person who originally wrote it will find it. And I found many fewer cases of academic integrity violations when working with open pedagogy projects where the work is publicly shared. And I've done it with this book project, and I've done it with a podcast series that I've had students create. The background. This course is a capstone course for economics majors and applied mathematical economics majors. In the past, I had them write a term paper, roughly the equivalent of a senior thesis. And I gave them in both the spring of 2019 and 2020, and I'll do it again this spring, the option of either doing term paper projects individually or working on some type of a collaborative project like this. And I let them choose a topic. In 2019, we were meeting face-to-face. Last year, as you know, we moved from a face-to-face to a synchronous online environment. And one of the things that really impressed me is how this assignment worked just as well when we moved to a remote environment as it did before. And in some ways, it made it a little bit easier since everyone was in Zoom already. It was pretty easy for students to meet virtually who had been in the past often trying to arrange to meet face-to-face at times outside of the class to do some of the work. And when they were meeting over Zoom, it just made it a whole lot easier to coordinate their work. Now, they could have been doing that before, and I encourage that. But in general, students weren't as likely to do it as they were after the transition when students became, dispersed over the state or over the country in some cases.
No, I'm sorry, John. Were they when you talked about them doing this work, did any of this work take place during class, or was it all extracurricular?
It was a mix of both. Much of the actual writing took place outside of the class, but I gave them time in each class period. It was a class that met once a week for almost 2 hours and 40 minutes or whatever the time slot is. And there was always some time slot for them to work in the groups. Often that was just reviewing some of the work, coordinating what they were going to do. Then they do some individual work, and then they'd meet together. And that was a mix between work outside of class and work within the class. I would say probably 2/3 or more of the work was done outside of it. Most of the writing was done outside of the class, but much of the coordination was done in the class meetings when they were meeting physically in small groups in the class, or when they were meeting on Zoom, they just met in breakout rooms and they use those to do the same type of thing. And I'd wander around and chat with them, go over give them some feedback, explain some of the feedback, answer their questions, and just go from table to or sets of tables to sets of tables, or in this case, from one Zoom room to the next. And it worked pretty well both ways.
Cool.
So I gave them the choice of what to do, and then I let them choose their topics. And the way I started at both years is I gave them a choice, and they wanted to try this. I said, well, what sort of topics would you like to do? And I gave them a couple of suggestions, which I thought were good. I said, or you can come up with your own. Each time they came up with their own. And that was good, though, because, they have more buy-in when it's their own topic, when they have some intrinsic motivation for it, because it's their own. They have more of a say in it. They have more autonomy in the whole choice of the project. They came up with a long list of topics, and we coalesced them into a broad theme that would overlap most of the topics they had suggested. And then once they had the topic, as a group, we discussed an organization into chapters, often taking the themes that they had been interested in doing research on and grouping them in some sort of reasonable way. And then the way we formed the groups was students each time wanted to form their own groups. The first time I did that, and some of the groups were really effective, others were a little bit less so. But what I did the second time, and this was based on a suggestion from a workshop from our Dean, Kristen Croyle, was to use a criteria to form the groups. Because what would happen is some of the groups were friends, and they sometimes work together really effectively, but sometimes they'd just be chatting when they were meeting in class. And because they were friends, they often would talk about things other than the project. When the groups were formed specifically for the project, they were more likely to be more on task. And that did seem to be the case. But another issue, and I observed this the first time I did this, is that the students who knew each other the best were the students who had taken the most classes together. They tended to be the students with the strongest backgrounds in the discipline or in the mathematical tools they'd be using and so forth. And then the other groups were students who hadn't taken quite as many courses or didn't have quite as rich of a background. And they were at a bit of a disadvantage. So the groups were not as balanced when I did that. And so the second time when they said they wanted to form their own groups, I said, well, here's some issues with it. And we discussed that, and they agreed it would be better than to use some criteria. And what I did basically is I just, I asked them how many prior math courses did they have. I put up a little form on a a QR code. And since we were meeting in physical classrooms, I put it up on the screen in the front of the class. They used a camera, scanned it in, and it just asked them how many prior economics and statistics courses they had completed, or statistics related courses they had completed by that point. I sorted that from highest to lowest, and then I just went down, and we had 8 groups one time, 9 the other. And I just went down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and cycled through that. And that way, each group had someone with a large amount of, stats and prior economics courses. And each group had some people who had fewer courses as a background. And it ended up creating much better balanced groups in general. And it wasn't sorted by the social capital and by their prior connections. So the groups ended up being much more evenly divided in terms of their background and so forth. And then they had already picked the topics, but they didn't know what topics they'd be doing. So they met in groups. This was still face-to-face both terms. This time it would be done in breakout rooms for the spring semester if this works the same way. I gave them 10 points, and then I let them submit them on pieces of paper. Next time it would be a form that they could allocate across the chapter. So if they really had a strong preference for one of the topics, they could vote all 10 points. If they only had if there were 2 they liked, they could put 5 and 5 on each, or they could allocate it however they wanted. And what happened basically is I took the first chapter, I looked at how many points were bid, and I gave it to whichever group bid the highest. If they were tied, we put that aside between those 2 groups, and then we went to the next one and saw how that worked out. And what happened is each group ended up and it worked both years this way, and I'm hoping that will continue, that each group ended up with either their first choice or their second choice. No one ended up with a third or fourth choice. And that was a really nice outcome. So they felt, they felt better being able to work on the topics that they had been suggesting. Often, some of them had been the ones who advocated the topic in general from the very beginning. The whole project was scaffolded from beginning to end. We, as a whole class, we used a shared Google document. We put together an outline, and we broke it up with some notes about what the main point should be in each chapter. And then the groups then submitted by the next class in a shared Google document a more detailed chapter outline, which we then discussed and gave them some feedback in during class. So we, as a whole class, we went through it after everyone had had a chance to look at it, and we found that there was some overlap. We shifted some things around. We discussed where the topics would most appropriately fit. In some cases, there were aspects that fit in both, but we narrowed it down so there would be less duplication, at least in theory. Sometimes that had to be revisited. And they also came up with a bibliography of resources. And then I gave them some feedback on that. And then the next stage, they came up with an annotated bibliography where they went through and read the papers and at least skimmed through the books that they were going to be using. And they provided a summary of how that related. And in some cases, I give them some feedback and, suggest maybe this doesn't quite belong here. Or more typically, I'd give them some suggestions of other areas they may want to look at. And then they submitted rough drafts in 2 stages. And at each stage of this, they were getting feedback from me, and they were also getting feedback from other students. And I'll talk about how I did that in just a minute. And then they submitted the final draft, and then they were allowed to do some editing on that too. And that became the final product. So at the very start, before they were writing anything, they agreed on the format so that we didn't have 5 different citation standards on that. So we, as a group, created a template document that would list the general format of each chapter and made notes about what format would be used for the endnotes or footnotes and the citations. And again, in many disciplines, there is a standard, MLA or APA or something similar, or Turabian or Chicago, whatever. In economics, every journal has its own. So that was a little bit of there is no standard. So I let them pick it. One time, I think they picked APA. The other time, they picked MLA. They chose the font and the size of the font and the general format of the chapter. And we created header structures so the documents would be accessible. And I shared that as a copyable document to each of the group. So each group each group in their own, going back a step, I created a Google Drive for the whole class and shared the access to that with all the students. And then within that, I created folders for each of the group. So they could each look at the work done by other groups, but all the groups worked within their own folder. And so they worked within their Google Drive folder, and then it was shared with everybody else. So the templates were shared within those. We reviewed copyright issues and so forth. And then, there it is. So all the group writing was done in the folder. The first year, it took students a little while to adjust to that because some of them just really wanted to work in Word. But then they'd have different versions of the chapter where one person would be writing it and someone else would be writing a different version, and then they'd have to combine it. And most of the groups took to this immediately, and I had talked about this as saying, do not use anything else, just do it right here. And that way we've got a current version of this that's the same for everybody. And that, they're all working on the same document. But at each of the deadlines, when there was a due date for the annotated bibliography, the first draft, the second draft, or the final draft, I took the work from the folder, saved it as a PDF, and uploaded it to another folder and used a hypothesis integration. And what that does is it lets students go in and annotate the PDF and put comments on it. And each student had to provide feedback on 3 chapters at each stage. Since there were either 8 or 9 chapters, each group ended up providing feedback on maybe the 3 chapters before theirs looping around, or the 3 chapters after, and then the next time they do the next 3, the next time they do the next 3, skipping their own. And that way each student ended up providing some feedback on all of the other chapters at least a couple of times over the course of the term. And Hypothesis works really nicely in that they're embedding the comments directly into the text, where they highlight a block of text and they add comments. And sometimes they disagree. So someone would put a comment saying you really should change this, and someone else says, well, I disagree. I like the way this argument is structured. Or they'd say, could you perhaps consider adding this feature or something else? Or maybe you may want to rephrase this a little bit to make it clearer. Ideally, sometimes initially some of the comments were just things like, correcting basic grammar, and I discouraged them from doing that. I wanted them to provide more substantive feedback. Some students kept doing that all the way through. But what was most effective is the students themselves said, we're getting these grammar corrections, which are fine, but we'd really like to get more feedback on what we actually wrote and what we can do to improve the quality of it. And when they heard that from other students, it really resulted in much higher quality feedback, because, I'd tell them that, and, they'd make minor adjustments, but when they heard it from their peers, it made a much bigger effect. And then the final product was copied over into a Pressbook format, which is built on the WordPress platform under a Creative Commons by CC BY license, which basically just requires attribution. So they agreed to share it so that anyone could use their work in any other work. It could be derivative. The only thing that people would have to do if they wanted to use anything they created is to attribute it back to them. And here are the 2 pages, the 2 sites. Let me just hop on one of those just to show you how it all ends up looking. So here's the book. It comes up with my name because I created the site. But if you go to read book and you pick one of the chapters, there's just an overview of how the project came about and why I did it. You go down to here. It's broken into sections. This was on income inequality and intergenerational mobility. So the first part of the book focused on trends on this within the US and across countries. And we can expand that like this. So there was one on income inequality in the US and global income inequality. Then the next section was on causes of income inequality, the growth in the skill premium, the increasing returns to education, the role of discrimination, the role of technological change, and some job skills becoming obsolete, the role of international trade and replacing low wage workers, and the impact of changing taxes and transfer payment programs. And then the last section focused on what we could do to try to deal with this, as well as some of the consequences of growth in income inequality. And, certainly we've seen some political polarization and reform proposals. And then when you go to any of these chapters, you'll see it has the names of the students who created it. And then you could just read through. This one was a little bit shorter than most of the others. It just worked out that way. But let me see, there was one that was particularly good in here. Well, I mean, overall, they all did a pretty good job. But here we go. This was, I think, one of the better ones. Yeah. And so, it looks very much like a book. And if they wanted to, and I gave them this option, if they wanted to create a cover page that meets this specific, it has to be done with a certain resolution and has to be done in CMYK colors, then it could be uploaded to Kindle, and they could, would be done as a free book. And I made the offer to them of doing the conversion if anyone wanted to create the cover page, because I'm just not very good at doing the graphic work. None of them chose to, but they have access to it. And so they can link to their chapters and share it more widely. So that's the process I used, and I just blew through all this. But overall, it was really popular. We did a podcast with 3 or 4 of the students the first time, and actually, let me share in the chat the slides so you'll have those links. Let me open the chat. Sorry. And I think this link will work. I'm going to make it as a copy one. So then you have that if you want to, see any of this or access any of it. Overall, I think it worked really well. So we don't have, I went through a little bit too long there, even though I was just racing through it. So what questions do you have?
Well, I mean, I know you do analytics and that type of thing. What kind of traffic have you seen on these books? Obviously, you're not out there marketing them like a normal publishing house would be, but
You know, I have not checked that. And let me see if I can find that. I'm not sure. Let me share the screen and maybe my guess is they're probably not going to be that much in demand. It's just there's so many of these things out there. But let me
no,
get
it is such a great and unfortunately always current topic. So I think that there's a lot of I'm quite interested in reading it at some point in my spare time, whatever that is. But
so it's let me see. I don't know if they provide analytics on that. But let
I
me
know
see if
most
they do.
WordPress stuff does, although they seem to have dumbed
Oops.
down their analytics recently. Check your passwords. Okay.
Yeah, apparently it's a password I use in one of the breaches. So someone could hack into this and rewrite it. So I got to change that. I just noticed that right now. So where would that be?
Yeah,
It would
normally
probably
there's
be in the admin panel, right?
yeah. Should be it might be under let's see.
Tools, maybe? No.
Depends. If there's something that says Jetpack, Jetpack usually has the
Well, see, here it's limited because it's pre-configured. It's built on WordPress, but it's a customized version of WordPress. So it's possible that it may not be there.
yeah, if it's not under tools, I don't know where it would be in this, but
Oh, Google Analytics. Um, hmm.
well, don't worry about it right now.
Yeah, so it's not set up for Google Analytics. So I could set it up for that, but I haven't actually.
Yeah. No, it's just I was just curious because I think it's good content. Just hoping it gets out. But I mean, I'm in your 330 anyway, so that's
Okay. That one's a little bit different. This was done with seniors. That one is done with freshmen.
oh
So
neat. Yeah.
mostly freshmen and sophomores.
Okay.
Let me stop the recording.